Can someone please explain to me why this book is so damn popular? Because I must have read the wrong one. But before we get to that, hey, my name is Frank. Welcome to my channel where I talk about all things bookish. Today we're going to be talking about Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, if you have not read the book or seen any of the film adaptations, then this video might not be for you, but feel free to stick around anyway. If you have seen any of the movies or you have read the book itself, let's get into it because I have some thoughts. Really quick before we begin, I just want to preface this by saying that if you have only seen the Dracula movies, Mina Harker is not Dracula's love interest in the book. He tries to turn her into a vampire, but otherwise there is no history. She was not like his love reincarnated. Okay, so just keep that in mind as you're watching this video. So normally this is the part of my review where I would tell you that I enjoyed reading this book and I would give you just a quick overview, but I'm not going to do that this time. One, because I didn't actually enjoy it, and two, because you have probably to some extent heard of Bram Stoker's Dracula before. Now, I have seen almost every rendition and adaptation of the film, and I have to say, every single one I've seen blows this book out of the water. I don't usually feel that way. More often than not, I feel like the book is usually the better version, but not in this case. Filmmakers have taken an incredibly mid book and made it a story worth paying attention to. Now, allow me to give credit where credit is due. Although this book was not the first published vampire novel, as it's often credited to be, that was Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, I believe. This book, Dracula, did popularize vampires in literature and introduced it to a wider audience. So in that regard, I can appreciate it for what it did. I think without it, we might not have actual good books about vampires. With that being said, this book had so many flaws and frankly, just things that I as a reader did not enjoy. So let's get into it. First, let's start with the things that I did actually like, because it will be brief. The very beginning of this novel could have and should have been the entire story. Jonathan Harker's trek through Transylvania, making it to Count Dracula's castle, being held prisoner, not knowing whether what he was seeing was real, all of this, the descriptions of the scenery as he travels, the eerie, cryptic feelings, this was all very pertinent to the Gothic genre, and I think it was done well. This is where Bram Stoker's writing really shined, and it made me excited for what was to come. Unfortunately, the rest of the book, including the characters from within this brief section, did not live up to my expectations. Another thing I liked was the storytelling device of using various first-person point of view journals and newspaper articles to explain the story. Bram Stoker was not the first person to use personal journals as a vehicle for storytelling, but regardless, I enjoyed it, so I'm including it. Now, moving on to why we're really here though, the things I did not like about this book. I'm just gonna say it, the Count's character is flat. Stoker starts the character off strong by describing his looks, how intelligent and well-spoken he is when Jonathan gets to the castle and meets him, but then for the rest of the book, he is condensed down to nothing more than an evil monster who barely makes any appearances. We know nothing about him other than the fact that he used to lead and command armies and that he's a vampire. He literally has no dialogue outside of the very beginning of the book when Jonathan Harker comes to Transylvania, and then once more when Mina Harker is recalling her memory of what Dracula said to her as he forced her to drink his blood. There's also another brief moment where he jumps out of a window and then turns around to make a fleeting comment about revenge, but that's about it. I really wish that Bram Stoker had given us a bit more background to this character and had kind of rounded him out, or at the very least, explained his intentions as to why he went through all of the trouble of leaving his home and went all the way to London with 50 boxes of dirt. To be fair, he does tell us, but his explanation boils down to, it's a city with a lot of people. That's what Bram Stoker tells us through Van Helsing's assumptions. I was just not invested in Dracula as a character, and it was disappointing considering he's the villain of the story. This issue was not strictly reserved for the Count. Every character was a bit static, but Dracula's character was the most disappointing for me. The pacing of this book was terrible. It dragged on for me. I'm not going to get too much into this point because I looked it up after I'd written most of the script for this video and found that it was published in installments in a newspaper or column, which I suppose excuses some of it, but still the pacing was just bad. A large section of this book was literally Lucy Westenra just waking up in the middle of the night and being on the verge of death for like weeks at a time.
I'm alive. I'm dead.
Bram Stoker focused on such insignificant things, in my opinion. It just felt like, although this is an allegory for good versus evil, it was just a lot of yapping about nothing. For instance, how many times do we have to hear about Renfield eating flies and spiders? For those who don't know or don't remember, Renfield is a patient of Dr. Seward's who is, for all intents and purposes, in the book, crazy. Like, we get it. He eats flies and spiders. You don't have to mention it every 2 chapters for an entire 3 pages every time. I kept waiting for the book to pick up and get exciting. Now, I know in the Gothic genre, it is not action-packed. It's usually more of a slow descent into madness or building up suspense. But I didn't feel that either. Any anticipation I felt was caused by boredom. I kept wondering when we were going to get to anything good. Aside from the bad pacing, the thing that really killed this book for me, the misogyny was rampant. At least that was my interpretation of it all. I know that I should take the time period that this was written into consideration, and I do, but even so, it was still a bit much. Actually, considering this was published around the time where the question of the new woman was prominent, I think that only strengthens my argument. Most of the female characters, aside from Mina Harker, had absolutely no distinguishing characteristics or attributes regarding their personality. Even in Mina's case, despite her intelligence and her spearheading the idea of collecting all their data and journals so that they can all be up to date on the facts of their situation, they still treated her like a pathetic, weak little woman in the name of saving her and keeping her pure. And I will get to the purity of it all in a second because I've got thoughts on that. Now, her intelligence and her mind were consistently praised as being of a man or as a male attribute, which was really annoying. Bram Stoker didn't just say it once, he said it like 3 or 4 times through Van Helsing's character. I was upset to read that after she went through the trouble of compounding all their information and had the mind to do it, right? It was her idea. The men still felt like they should exclude her from the conversation as if somehow she wouldn't worry about them because that was their reasoning. They didn't want her to worry because she was too delicate. They kept framing it like they were doing her a favor and protecting her. I'm well aware that this might have been intentional on Bram Stoker's part. He could have been making some point about men always failing women, and I'll get to that train of thought later in the video. Now, this idea of misogyny is reiterated when Lucy Westenra is constantly failed by the men around. Same characters. Her purity is dependent on whether the men can protect her, and we're led to believe, at least partially, that her death was her mother's fault for removing all of the garlic from the window and her neck. But how did neither of these doctors think to tell everyone in the house, including her mother, not to remove the garlic? Now, I know that this was to push the story forward, but it just felt very intentional for Stoker to inadvertently blame this poor woman instead of the 2 doctors who didn't think to say anything. So the constant mention of purity was just another thing that I did not particularly like. Like I said, I know that for the time period and considering the religious overtones in the book being a huge part of it, good versus evil, it's not that I didn't understand it, it's just that I didn't like it. If it had really been the point of this story that evil corrupts and makes one impure and unclean, which are words that he uses many times in the book, then he would have harped on it more when Jonathan Harker was going through his whole situation. Okay, Stoker could have easily included something about how close Jonathan had come to being corrupted or unclean when the 3 female vampires almost ate him in the castle, but instead he reserved all of this nonsense for the only 2 women in the entire book who had any significant part at all. This was just purity culture repackaged. He presented this in the idea of Mina Harker now being unclean and impure because the men around her failed at every turn, resulting in the Count punishing her for their decisions to try and hunt him down. Something that really compounded this point for me was the fact that the only people that Dracula had turned into vampires were other women. Between the 3 in the castle, Lucy, and then his attempt at Mina, it felt like some kind of bogus commentary about women being easily corrupted or something. Stoker could have nullified this point by simply having Dracula turn Renfield into a vampire, but instead, he killed him. Now, the point can be argued that the Count didn't turn Renfield because he betrayed him. The man had a change of heart when he realized that Dracula was feeding on Mina, whom he liked as a person. And that's why he wasn't turned into a vampire. But we're talking of purity, and Stoker showcases purity through the blatant infantilization of Lucy's character and forces us to internalize the Madonna whore complex. When Jonathan Harker is trapped in Castle Dracula, he is terrorized by the 3 nameless female vampires. It shows them as lustful, cruel, wicked harlots. This point is further pushed later on in the book when Van Helsing is about to kill them. He's sexualizing them. He frames it as he's saving their souls and whatnot, but when Lucy was turned into a vampire, although there was a moment of lustfulness when she asks Arthur for a kiss, the fact that Stoker wrote her to only feed on children signifies to me that he wanted to keep her character pure and innocent as best as he could, despite her being a vampire. If he had her running around London feeding on big, strong men, then that would have destroyed the reader's perception of her being dainty and fragile. Now look, this is all just my interpretation of the text. So, I don't really like to read other people's thoughts or reviews until after I've formed my own. So it's entirely possible that everything I'm saying is complete poo-poo. It's doubtful though. Moving on. Now, like I mentioned earlier, maybe the whole point of Bram Stoker writing it in this way was to point out that women are constantly punished for men's insolence and incompetence. He could very well have been trying to make a feminist point about women are constantly being sidelined and that the men in their lives put them in harm's way even when they think they're doing the right thing. The men in this book are always making decisions for other people that are not their choices to make. I don't know. Personally, I don't think this is the case with Stoker's writing. All I know is that this man really harped on all the wrong things, and he failed to expand in areas that I feel could have really just brought the story together in a more impactful and substantial way. I wish that the Count had more dialogue, or at the very least, more backstory to explain why he did all of the things he did. I feel like if you're going to tell the story of good versus evil, fine. But evil doesn't exist in a vacuum. Unless, of course, you're Dracula. Apparently then you're just evil for funsies. It felt lazy, to be honest with you. I'm sure that had this not been the thinly veiled, God-fearing, conservative propaganda that it seems, it would not have been so popular. I suppose I can imagine how people back in the day cared about it, but for the life of me, I cannot figure out why people still glaze this book so hard. Even if it wasn't pushing the narrative that women are weak, helpless creatures that need men to save them, lest they be corrupted by evil, it would still be a mid-novel.
His gear, whack. His jewelry, whack. His footsteps, whack. The way that he talks, whack. The way that he doesn't even like to smile, whack.
The writing itself wasn't anything spectacular, and the characters were all flat, aside from maybe Van Helsing. One could argue that he was the most substantial character in the book, although personally I found Renfield to be the most interesting one of all. It's also worth mentioning how much Stoker relied on coincidence to carry this novel through. Like, what do you mean Dracula's ship just happened to crash into the Whitby harbor where Mina and Lucy were staying? What do you mean that one of the properties that he purchased just happened to be right next door to the insane asylum where Dr. Seward lived and worked? None of this was ever explained in a way that was satisfactory. It just was. That is some piss poor writing. Something else that really bugged me was the timeline of Van Helsing's comings and goings while Lucy was sick. He went back and forth from London to Amsterdam like 12 times. He was coming and going either every day or every other day, and it just felt unrealistic and like a logistical nightmare. I looked it up, and current trains take about 5 hours or so to make the trip one way. Assuming that back in 1897, the travel time was similar, that's still an insane journey to make back and forth like 4 times in 1 week, especially for an old man. Now, for the pièce de résistance of this ass book, the ending. What the absolute was that? I read this as an ebook, so my version was 583 pages. The last chapter itself was 25 pages. Bram Stoker spent 20 of them talking about nothing. Literally, the first 20 pages of the last chapter are about Mina and Van Helsing's journey through the mountains and up to the castle. I will say that a few pages were dedicated to Van Helsing killing the 3 female vampires, which got more words than Dracula's death scene. The last 5 pages, we get to the point where the group has caught up with the men who are transporting Dracula's coffin back to his castle. And Bram Stoker was kind enough to spare a grand total of about maybe 30 words describing how Jonathan Harker and Quincy Morris kill him. And to make it all that much better, Morris, who is the chillest dude, he's the American, has to be the one who dies. His death felt so pointless and so forced. It's like Stoker thought to himself, well, I can't have everyone stay alive at the end of all of this. So let's take the most skilled, well-trained hunter and fighter of the group and have him be the one who dies for no damn reason. Meanwhile, Jonathan, who's a thin stick of a man with no fighting skills, somehow survives his tussle with the men who are transporting Dracula's coffin. What really pissed me clean off was that they brought a bunch of guns with them. Bram Stoker writes about his precious fucking Winchesters like 3 times. The hideous part, Arthur, Dr. Seward, Van Helsing, and Mina have their guns trained and pointed at the group of men who are fighting Quincy and Jonathan. It's just like, shoot them. Oh no. Instead, you're just gonna watch your friend get hacked to bits. But whatever, I digress. The best, and by best I mean the worst, part of it all was the wrap up. Bram Stoker gave us half a page of like, oh, by the way, it's 7 years later. Mina and I have a son named Quincy who was born on the day his namesake died. Another coincidence. And John Seward and Arthur Holmwood are happily married now. Half a page! Half a page is what we got to wrap this all up. Honestly, this book was trash, and I'm glad I read it through the library because I would be livid if I actually spent money on a copy of this. Anyway, feel free to drag my ass in the comments if you disagree. I'm sure there are people who loved this book for some of the reasons that I didn't. I'm not here to influence you, but in my humble opinion, this book is not worth the hype. I wouldn't waste your time unless you're just looking for bragging rights to say that you read it or something. Now, I'm curious if any of you have read this and thought that my review was off base. Let me know what you think in the comments. I will be checking out other reviews on Goodreads to see if my analysis was close to what people thought. But for more book-related content, feel free to like and subscribe. Until next time.